In this video I want to talk about what is public policy, what are the core elements or the ingredients that go into what public policy is, and why does it matter? So why do we need to think about public policy in a more analytical or thoughtful way? So first let's talk about, well, what is public policy? There's many definitions in the literature. I won't go over those, but let me just pull out some key ideas that one will often find in the texts and the articles that discuss public policy, or for that matter, economic policy or social policy. First of all, one key idea, of course, is the word public in the idea of public policy. This usually means that we're talking about decisions and courses of action made by governments or other related public authorities in state sectors or public sectors. So this could be anything from local school boards, municipalities, library boards, police boards, the whole array of public authorities at municipal or metropolitan or city areas, state level or provincial level, provincial governments, legislatures, the courts, and cabinet decisions, and of course at the national level in Canada with the Parliament, Canadian Cabinet, and the whole array of crown corporations and regulatory boards and other agencies attached to or associated with the Government of Canada. So literally thousands of organizations across the country, tens of thousands in fact, comprise the public sector, and most more or less have some authority or capacity to make decisions on behalf of the public and under some kind of legislative or statutory basis that provides them their authority and the responsibilities and powers to make public policy. Sometimes we talk about public policy more broadly to include the voluntary sector who may be mandated to deliver services on behalf of a public authority. So it can get quite broad, but let's just focus on public authorities. Now, the policy side often refers to a course of action or a series of decisions or courses of action. Policy often is an idea that's thought of as a particular position or a stance, a direction with a set of goals or objectives to which the public authority makes some sort of formal commitment to, some direction, some commitment to the public. In addition, we've also got public authority that's increasingly being delegated to Aboriginal authorities from governments or through their own right, through treaty negotiations or the negotiation of new treaties or the refurbishment or revitalization of long-standing old treaties that have been signed a century or two ago in Canada. So that's a whole other sector of public policy that's quite fascinating with many new directions and developments. Public policy not only is about actions, but it's also about inactions or non-decisions. This sometimes is a confusing or counterintuitive idea for people to appreciate or to think about, but public policy is as much about deciding what not to do, keeping issues off the political agenda, governments deciding not to respond to claims or demands by the public or issues that perhaps the media has whipped up as a hot topic of discussion of the news of the day. So much of policy making really is about regulating and keeping and screening issues off the agendas, be it of a municipal council, a school board, provincial cabinet, or a federal Parliament of Canada. So that's a fascinating area of public policy to research and to look into as to how issues do eventually get onto agenda, or what sorts of factors and what kind of interest groups or ideas or resources are used or needed to get an issue onto the radar, so to speak, or onto the agenda of governments. And another thing to think about public policy is how old or new a policy is. Many public policies in Canada have a long history, a long tradition, and with that comes a routine and established vested interests associated with the delivery of that public policy if it relates to providing some services or benefits. Also, the absence of policy, whether groups really prefer not to have a public policy that might be seen as regulatory or constraining their freedoms or actions. So there may be some people calling for example, regulation of whitewater rafting or other kinds of extreme sports. On the other hand, the people that engage in those might resent or resist the idea that they need to come under the surveillance or closer regulatory or legislative inspection or surveillance of government. So depending on the issue, depending on what your own interests are in society, what your own pursuits are, there can be a tension between those calling for more public policy and those who, in fact, are happy to have no public policy in certain areas of their lives. But certainly over the last many decades or centuries, public policy seems to have moved into more and more facets of our lives, private as well as our social and public lives. Some of the core elements of public policy. First of all, they're about people. That seems like an obvious point, but often it's not just about the bureaucrats or the officials or the politicians. The judges that can be involved in policy as well, but first and foremost, and in the final analysis, policy is about some public or publics, some community, be it individuals, families, a social group, Aboriginal peoples, persons with disabilities, single moms, campers, recreation, outdoors people. There's a whole host of ways of the way we think of the public. It's carved up, sliced and diced, so to speak, in terms of how public policy relates to a Canadian society or a Canadian community. So people are quite important. Purpose. Any public policy is really an expression of an idea that we can make a purposeful impact, we can pursue some objectives and make a difference, change the way society would otherwise unfold or events might develop unless we had a public policy in that area. So behind any policy, first people, secondly purposes, objectives, goals, some intentions. And at some point along the history or life of a policy, there'll be some authoritative or official definition or declaration of what those purposes are. Usually expressed quite vaguely, perhaps what might be called motherhood statements in a piece of legislation or a government document, a throne speech, a set of remarks by a leading politician, but somewhere along the way we can dig out some statement around purpose. Every policy, to make it more than just something on paper, needs some procedures and mechanisms, some devices, organizational structure, some staff that get devoted to the actual interpretation and implementation of that policy. Where we move from the broad policy, perhaps expressed in legislation, down to more specific rules, procedures, and the ways and means of actually carrying out the policy through some administrative mechanisms. That can be in rules, procedures, programs, services, and benefits, and so forth. Policies then result in some kind of product or output, some deliverable, some intended effect onto a community or addressing some kind of issue. There's an array of different products to think about in policy. There can be just symbolic statements, provision of information to the public to inform them to make wiser decisions, the labeling of consumer products, for example. Might be a very soft way of changing people's behavior to make healthier choices in the foods they buy and eat and consume. There can be regulations or laws of thou shalt and thou shalt not kinds of behaviors, and behind those penalties, be financial penalties or even criminal code infractions, can be jail time or other kinds of penalties associated with that. A lot of people, when they think of public policy, they think of the public services or programs, be it healthcare or education, social services. Some people think of policy as a way to provide new rights or entitlements or a guaranteed access to some kind of service for a group in need. Perhaps families with children with autism who are fighting for access to better services, be that medical care, equipment, education, or therapeutic programs or services to help support their family. And a lot of policy is expressed in words and symbols. There's a lot of, in this day and age, spin and constructing an image or a theme, creating a feel, the sound bites that we live in this media age. A lot of policy seems to be, and the sound bite seems to be a substitute for more concrete action and policy making. And finally, policy is about power. Let's not forget that we talk about policy being something that comes from public authorities. With that comes a mandate, authority, the rule of law, the sovereign powers of federal provincial governments under the Canadian Constitution. And with that are ideas of legitimacy and authority, and whether we ought to obey or not to obey a law, and what are the relationships between democratic dissent or protest and authority and law and order. So when we think about policy, those are some of the core elements that I would suggest we need to always think about. Now, typically I've found in my career in research and writing and the community groups I work with that groups tend to focus on one or two of these various aspects of policy. They may focus on the actual deliverables. They're focusing on a particular program or service that's been around. Often we talk about issues as if people didn't exist in them. Government sometimes and politicians can discuss an issue in such broad, abstract terms that we don't see a face. We don't see the idea that there are real communities, real people and individuals in need. Sometimes that's a deliberate tactic to try to diffuse an issue or try to tone down the anger of a community group that might be fighting for better policy or a change in policy. But it's good to try to recall that policy comprises several elements, and at times some groups will deliberately ignore or play down one of those elements to try to advance their own interest. Finally, why does policy matter? Well, you might say, well, the obvious is that policy provides supports and services and law and order and various other kinds of programs that benefit people. On the other hand, a lot of people think of policy as a constraint, as a threat, as something that gets in the way of their everyday life. Some people I talk to who work in the human services as frontline workers, nurses, social workers, teachers, child and youth care workers, they often think of policy as something that's made by someone else higher up in the hierarchy, their bosses or their bosses' bosses, and policy to them is something about rules that constrain their ability to do what often they think would be in the best interests of a student or as a patient or as a client. So many people who work in public agencies see policy somewhat more critically, somewhat more frequently as a constraint on what they do rather than providing an opportunity to achieve some goal or objective. So that's always an important point as well. And obviously policies can recognize groups and communities who have long been ignored, and for example, be it same-sex marriage, the rights of newcomers or immigrants to Canada, groups that have been ignored in the past who fight for the right to be recognized. Public policy can be incredibly important symbolically to provide public recognition and acknowledgement of the existence of a group, the right of that group to exist, and the right of that group to be treated with greater respect and equality and dignity. So public policy is critical to the whole idea of what it means to be a Canadian citizen and what it means to live within a political community, whether that's a province or in the country. So those are some of the ideas, therefore, about what is public policy, what are the components or elements of public policy, and why does public policy matter. So thank you.